Thank you for joining me. This is the Bold Lines podcast, and I am your host, Travis Thompson. Today, we're going to be talking about the two types of trauma we experience. It's going to be a good thing at the beginning of this episode to get something out of the way. Whenever the word trauma is brought up in therapy or general conversation, it's become very apparent that what people categorize as trauma and what actually is clinical trauma is very different. I'm not here today to downplay anyone's traumatic experiences in their life, but I do believe that actually affirming what trauma is can give a sense of validation, and cutting away the stuff that people call traumatic but was really just sad can help us sort through what the differences are and what we actually experience. So let's go into where this is overblown, okay? 1, bad feelings are not trauma. When someone disappoints you, that is not trauma. When you get stood up for a date, that is not trauma, okay? It might feel sort of traumatic, I guess. That's not trauma. Clinically significant trauma, what I'm talking about today, and when most therapists and psychologists talk about trauma, is something entirely different. I'm going to explain this in a general sense, and then we can get into the minutia later. Clinically significant trauma, from an overall perspective, is when something is so emotionally overwhelming it cannot be processed in the moment or after. What I mean by emotionally overwhelming is not that something was a lot. It's that you couldn't resolve the emotions. You couldn't walk through the memories in your head in a way that would play out. It wouldn't take care of itself. It still sits on the mind. That's what clinically significant trauma is. It cannot be broken down simply through time or breathing. Now, some of that definition gets a little wonky because if you're doing breathing and meditation or mindfulness, whatever it is, you can break down some trauma. But for the most part, things that are clinically significant in terms of trauma, that's not going away by deep breathing. So let me get into the two types of clinically significant trauma. I talk about some of this in my book, but I do want to give some overall definitions that might be helpful. When I work with clients on trauma, it's usually pretty helpful to categorize what is big T trauma and little t trauma. Both things are incredibly harmful to someone's well-being, but I do think it's important that we are able to tell the difference. Let's start with big T trauma. When I talk about big T trauma, I'm referencing the events, I'm referencing the scenarios that come to people's minds. A great example of this is being in the middle of a crime, like getting robbed, or let's say there's a natural disaster that happens. Big T trauma are these events that we can point to. Big T trauma can also be things that we witness or were a part of. Maybe we were not robbed, but maybe someone close to us was. If we watched it happen, that could certainly bring on what I would call big T trauma. Or maybe we're just around it. Something happens next to us or near us. That can also be considered big T trauma. Big T trauma is what is often most referenced in therapy. When somebody comes in for sessions and they talk about having a traumatic past, typically, through a little bit of work, people identify these big points in their lives where they have memories that are stuck. Now, this is incredibly important to work through. To be able to sort through and experience the emotions related to the trauma is the bulk of the work. When someone's able to see these things happen in front of them and be able to resolve it, what we would consider clinically significant trauma slowly starts to die down. One of the issues with big T trauma is it becomes a waypoint of sorts that somebody can say, this was my life before, and this was my life after. This is what we talk about most of the time when we treat PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's big T trauma. There are these little points that people talk about. There's some issues, though, with big T trauma. One, it's incredibly difficult to work with. But two, and I think one that most people don't talk about a whole lot, people can turn big T trauma into markers or idols or ways that they can defer from current problems. And I know this next part is going to be a little reductionistic, but give me a chance and I'll explain. Let's say someone had experienced trauma within their family and really has a hard time trusting. And then they start dating in their adult life. And instead of being able to connect, they struggle to engage and ultimately pull away. Now, could that be from big T trauma? Absolutely. It can also be used as an excuse for poor behavior. While the trauma might be clinically significant, how you respond to it might be inappropriate or not very useful. So big T trauma, something we should work on, but also I've seen in my practice, and other clinicians have attested to this, that sometimes big T trauma is this little idol that people don't want to go away. Because if they dealt with their big T trauma, then nothing else can excuse the crap that they do. So that's big T trauma. Sometimes it's truly overwhelming and people are unable to work past it. Sometimes it's overwhelming and people use it as an excuse for poor behavior. Now let's go to little T trauma. This is the one that's a little bit more elusive and one that most people don't think about when they hear the word trauma. Little T trauma is a little bit different. It's not talked about as much. Little T trauma is something that's overlooked and downplayed. Instead of being large events, natural disasters, crimes, accidents, things like that, little T trauma is representative of the beliefs and environments that we grow up in or we are a part of. This is wonderfully explained by my wife, actually. She works with kids a lot, and they can describe big T traumas that happen. But one thing that those kids don't realize is, yes, there was a crime that happened nearby, or there was an issue with a parent, whether it was abuse or something else, neglect. But here's the thing. What's often more difficult to pinpoint and to treat is when you grow up in an environment that is unsafe. Maybe a child hasn't experienced being the victim of a crime, but if they live in an area where that's something that's rather common, that can actually produce traumatic responses. I think one of the best examples that I've ever heard from my wife in all of this is that kids, let's just say, get a new pair of shoes. They might become more aggressive or protective. Is that because anything bad is happening? No. But maybe they've experienced in the place that they grew up in the place they go home to that having a new pair of shoes isn't always the best idea because someone might want those new pair of shoes, whether you're wearing them or not. That's what I mean by little T trauma. It's the place you grow up. It's what we experience without being able to resolve. It's this overall understanding of how you fit in the world, who you are as a person, how you engage with your family and community, how you get a sense of identity. Here's the crazy thing about little T trauma. Most people would downplay it, but in a lot of cases, it can actually be more significant. Now, why is that? If you haven't been robbed, let's go to the pair of shoes. Let's say you haven't had your shoes taken, but you've seen people around you. How could that be worse? Well, it's not necessarily the trauma itself. It's how people are unable to access it or deal with it. If it's quote unquote not a big deal, even if you're having all of the symptoms, then it makes it really difficult to address or empathize with. Hey, if it didn't happen to you, then why are you upset? It's a common thing that I hear in therapy. The really, really harmful thing about little t trauma is that it doesn't just give you an overall understanding of the world, it helps shape your sense of identity, who you are, and what it means to be you and in the world. I also see little t trauma in other ways that aren't immediately obvious. I've had plenty of clients that will say, well, my childhood was normal, no big deal. Come to find out that there was a lack of safety, but it wasn't obvious. It wasn't physical, but maybe it was emotional. This is one of those categories that can be overblown, but I hope you just take me at face value and know that I can tell the difference. But there are plenty of people who grow up in a home where emotions are not discussed, vulnerability is not encouraged, and you're made to feel small and unimportant. I would consider that, if the symptoms reflected, to be traumatic. Because trauma isn't just loud. If you go back to the beginning of this episode and you were to listen again to what I define trauma as, it has nothing to do with the exact thing that happened. It's just our inability to process it. So trauma isn't just loud, but it can be a restriction from feeling. So you can have a family unit that seems well put together. They seem to be able to handle things on the outside, at least. I would call that a white picket fence family. But on the inside, people struggle to connect. And sometimes it's not just struggling. Maybe there's this overt sense of putting things down. Oftentimes with little t trauma in childhood, there aren't explicit messages. Clients don't always remember when their parents told them to shove things down and not talk to them, but they do recognize this prevailing sense of a lack of safety. So which one is more traumatic? To experience a clinically significant trauma-induced event, or to be a part of an environment or a community where you're always on your toes, you're always concerned. Here's the crazy thing. Both big T and little t trauma can show the same symptomology, but it can get overlooked if clients don't have an awareness of what exactly happened to them. Think of things that we would normally associate with post-traumatic stress disorder, things like hypervigilance, concern for others, high stress or anxiety, maybe even a tendency to acquiesce or fold, or maybe a concern of where they are in the room or how they should respond to things. This can also be in a religious context, like how they relate to God, to higher power or religious authority. See, those symptoms, if they fit, even if you can't point to a single event or experience, they can show that someone has experienced trauma. And it's not just childhood where these things pop up. Those just seem to be the most significant because that's when our brain is developing and we're starting to understand the world. But we can see this later on in an adult life as well. What happens when a relationship isn't safe? That someone knew what safe relationships were, but then things changed. Or let's say they go to a new job where all of a sudden everything was great on the surface, and you get in and the go-getter attitude and the electric family-based culture turns into something not so great, like working you into the ground and expecting that work family really means that it's an abusive emotional situation. Could that be considered traumatic? I've worked with clients where they work at a job for a while and all of a sudden they become hypervigilant. They have trouble sleeping. They have disconnected relationships and they become overly irritable. Could you consider that traumatic? I don't know. Can they work through these responses on their own, or are they becoming stuck? Obviously, significant events in adulthood can also bring on traumatic responses. If someone experienced a natural disaster, I remember when tornadoes came through Middle Tennessee. I remember that to this day. I wasn't an adult, but I've met many adults who, when that memory pops up, they seem to change slightly. I can even admit myself when I was younger, now that I'm an adult and I have a family, when that tornado alarm goes off, we're all in a closet. And if you're not in this part of the United States, that might seem odd. But here, when a tornado siren rings, you're not always entirely sure where it's coming from. And because I learned that as a kid, I can recognize that I might have trauma responses, but still going to do it because it's not going to hurt anybody. And I do want my family to be safe. There's a reasonable assumption in all of this. So what do we do with trauma responses? Because some people can say, well, just downplay it, just deal with it. And that's certainly not the case. Although there does seem to be a trend in the exact opposite direction, where, my goodness, you have trauma. You should be in therapy for 5 years. Okay, there's obviously a middle ground in all of this. So how do we handle it? First thing that you should know, not all trauma requires therapy. A lot of people work through clinically significant trauma events without ever stepping foot in a therapist's office. Is that because they're just some sort of special? I don't know, maybe. Wish I was one of those people, and I think a lot of my clients would think the same. But some people have communities around them. They have personal beliefs or relationships that can either shield trauma responses or they can quickly heal them. So anytime somebody experiences trauma, they don't have to go to therapy. On the opposite end, there are people who have highly significant trauma responses that don't go to therapy, and they should. Usually I hear that from kids or a partner or a spouse. For those that do need to go to therapy, trauma work is sometimes complex and sometimes straightforward. Let me give you the straightforward part first. If you've experienced trauma, big T or little t, a lot of therapy is just sitting still, being connected with a therapist or whoever's sitting in front of you and just being where you're at. Where it gets a little complex is how you sit that way or how you process it. There are many therapies out there like EMDR. There's a really common one. Things like CBT. And if you want to look up those definitions later, you can, because I quite honestly don't remember what EMDR stands for. But there are ways of dealing with this, and you could sit in it. You could talk to someone about it. Some people even find relief by telling the story over and over again. That's actually how children deal with it. When they experience clinically significant trauma, the one thing that they need to do is to tell the story over and over again until they can control it and change the outcome. For those that are scared of if they're going to glorify their trauma, like I said before, make an idol of it, they're probably not. Those usually aren't the people that I'm worried about glorifying trauma. Those that come in and weep and wail, as it were. Do I have empathy? Of course. That might be a coping mechanism for their trauma. But also, I consider all of my clients to be whole, competent human beings. So for those people, we sit in it. For many of my clients, a lot of the trauma work is talking about not much of anything, but it's being in the presence of someone who knows what happened and isn't judging you for it, isn't putting you down or blaming you for things that aren't your fault. If we can recognize and understand big T and little t trauma, we can treat them effectively. Maybe there are more people out there with little t trauma than we recognize. Maybe that's you yourself as you're sitting here listening to this podcast, that you grew up in an environment or you've been a part of an environment for a while that was emotionally unsafe. or you couldn't talk about anything. You had to shove everything and figure it out. Maybe that could help you make sense of some of the responses that you have, the way that you talk to people. If you're unable to process that on your own, it can be helpful to find a therapist. Find a good one. Find someone who actually knows how trauma works, because if you go to someone, a doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist, or a therapist that doesn't understand trauma, you might get a terrible diagnosis. Do you really have ADD or ADHD, or do you just have PTSD? Where the inattentive or anxious part of it just keeps you moving because if you sat still, bad thoughts would come through your head. If you find someone who's competent in trauma work, they should likely be calm. They should be able to be engaged. If you don't get that feeling, they're probably not the trauma therapist for you. But good trauma therapy helps you manage symptoms, first at least. It's something you'll take along the way. However, the more difficult part, both for the therapist and the client, is to be able to sit in the terrible things that have happened, validate the experience, but challenge the beliefs of who that person is and what they've dealt with. Yes, something terrible happening to you, if you didn't cause it, isn't your fault. How you deal with it is. The first way that you deal with it is to have someone sit with you in it and slowly work your way out. That part is up to you. So let's review big T and little t trauma and see what we can do with it. And maybe you as the listener can get some direction of your own. This big T trauma, these events and experiences, it's what everyone shows up for in therapy. But sometimes they can be waypoints, times where you delineate before and after. Sometimes they become excuses. Sometimes they're brushed aside. Little t trauma is the overall experience that someone has, the beliefs that they develop about themselves in relationship to family, significant others, a higher power, children, anything like that. Little t trauma is also how someone develops their view of the world and how they interact outside of it. Both big T and little t trauma can have PTSD symptoms or just other trauma symptoms. You don't have to have both. I hope for anyone listening, take some time to self-reflect. Put away distraction and sit with yourself for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. When you have nothing to do, no one's asking anything of you, what comes to mind? Do you stress about things that don't logically follow? If so, there's a chance that you're having trauma responses. If the ways that you interact with people are out of proportion, again, there's a good chance that maybe something else is happening. If that is the case, find someone who is knowledgeable, someone who can help, and see if maybe that therapist or that psychologist or maybe just a friend would be willing to sit down with you in big T or little t trauma, help you relax, be present, feel cared for, be able to move through it. Thanks for listening today. I hope you got something useful out of the podcast. If you feel the need, you can leave something in the tip jar to help pay for the production of this podcast. If not, I hope you follow this podcast, you subscribe, and you share this podcast with those that you can so they can find hope and healing for their lives as well.